Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and today I am finally back to reviewing Forbidden Doors, book number 2, The Deceived by Bill Myers. Now, this is, like I said, book number 2 in the Forbidden Doors series. And this is a series unlike Fear Street, which I think this series is totally based on the idea of a Fear Street type series. Unlike Fear Street, these books have to be read in order because they are a continuous story. At least these first, I believe, 3 books that I've read so far, they're all a continuous story that kind of blend into each other and continue storylines and plot lines throughout each one. So in this one, The Deceived, we find our main characters, Becca and Scott, up against some more demonic activity in their hometown of Crescent Bay, California. This is a wild series, I just gotta say. It is a Christian book series, a YA one from the 1990s, and it is wild because it's all about these 2 kids who are literally battling against demons in their hometown. Now, this book is the book that scared me, made me so scared of hypnotism and hypnosis because of this book, which I think is something that is an intriguing point to bring up right at the beginning. Books do inform our worldview. Books do tell us a lot about what we think about things. When we read a book, especially in a story, I think there are parts of a story that do inform us and do tell us about what we should think about the world. So that is always something interesting, especially with books that you read as a kid that you loved and then you come back to and you're kind of looking at it through an adult perspective and looking at the book and saying, oh, well, that's interesting. That's an interesting way they portrayed X, Y, or Z, because that definitely informed what I think about something. So this is a book that scared me so bad about hypnotism. And I will just say, I don't ever want to be hypnotized. It scares me so much. It kind of freaks me out a little bit. And so I just don't ever want to. But in this book, Becca goes to a local, kind of like a TED Talk but 90s version. So it's not really, a TED Talk because they didn't have that back then. But this was like a TED Talk sort of thing where this guy is presenting. So they go to hear this TED Talk by this guy named Maxwell Hunter, who is a hypnotist. And so he is going to, and he's an expert on reincarnation. And so he is going to talk to the audience about reincarnation, about hypnotism, and Becca gets selected to be one of the people hypnotized. And as she's hypnotized, she has this vision of a past life. And she's not sure what this all means, but she thinks that she's somewhere in a place in a forest riding on a horse. And that's kind of all the vision is, but it feels so real and so vivid that it starts to haunt her. And she can't get it out of her head. And soon she comes to realize that there is something else going on here more than a simple hypnotism, because there is something demonic at work. I mean, I kind of told you that they're battling demons already, so I don't think that's a spoiler because that's what this whole series is. But there's something else at work here, and this is not a good vision. But Becca's going to have to figure it out because these visions won't stop now that she's had one. What is going on? You will have to read to find out. Now, I will say, this book, it's a little complicated to talk about because there's a lot of things going on. There are multiple storylines that are happening. They're kind of woven together, and that's partly because this series, like I said, is continuing from the first book. So the first book has Becca and her brother Scott. They are former missionary kids who have moved back to the United States after living in South America for years, and so they moved back to the United States to Crescent Bay, California. And in the first book, there was a demonic Ouija board that they were fighting against and had to deal with, and so there's also amulets and charms and all these different things that are happening in that book. In this one, like I said, they are now seeing that there is something going on with these visions that Becca is having, and she's trying to figure out what's real, what's not real, what's happening, what's not happening. And it feels like it is leading her to something. Now, I started to remember pieces of this book as I was reading it, and the ending of this book was really intense. This book just brings up some complicated subject matter that I think if you are a person who's sensitive to different kinds of complicated things, it would be better to know going in. I'm trying not to say those things because I know that on YouTube it would kind of flag this video because of some of the topics that are discussed, which on one hand I do think are really important to discuss. However, I don't know if this book has the length to completely address the topics in a way that is super helpful. I also think this book contains some very interesting portrayals of different kinds of people, and I really struggled with trying to decide if the portrayals of the people in this book were accurate to life or if it was a caricature. In some ways, it doesn't come across as much as a caricature of different types of people as I was afraid at first, but I do think there's a hint of it. For instance, at the very beginning of the book, that we find out that Becca's boyfriend, Ryan, he is a part of the Big Brother program, and he has a kid that he hangs out with that lives on the poor side of town. And the portrayal of that side of town is it's very on the line, in my opinion, of the way that they talk about it. And so it's just something to be aware of going into this book. The other thing I would say is this book does not have a ton of action. The first book had a little more action, a little more suspense that way. This book is a little more psychological because, but like I said, Becca's trying to figure out what's real, what's false, what's fake, what's true, and she can't parse it together. There's also in these books, like I said, this is complicated. There is a subplot about a character named Z. And we find out about Z a little bit in the first book because Scott, the younger brother, meets Z over what's called a bulletin board. Back in the 1990s, there were these things called bulletin boards, which is like sort of like old-time social media in a way. You could dial up to these bulletin boards and type to people, kind of chat with them, that sort of thing. Some of them were local, they were all over the world. And Z is a character that we do not know hardly anything about, is talking to Scott and Becca over the bulletin board. And we know today this is not a wise thing to do because you do not know who anyone is on the internet. You just don't. So there's definitely a piece of this that is stuck in the 90s when that was a brand new thing and it was very novel and no one was thinking about that. In the re-releases of these books, they actually did add a note about that and talking about like safety online, internet safety, those sorts of things. And so I think that was really good for the re-release. But these originals don't talk about that. So there's also complicated book, like I said. There's also a piece of this book that is dated, has some dated language. There is a character who talks about people in a very derogatory way. And I do think that's very dated and has not aged. And so that's another thing to go into this book knowing. There is some outdated language. I did check the re-release of this book to see, did they change that language? In the first re-release of this book, they did not change it. I have not checked the second re-release of this book when they put these into kind of a bind up with like 3 or 4 books. I did not check that one to see whether it has updated language or not. But as far as I know, the first re-release did not update any of that language, which those came out in the early 2000s when some of this language was kind of fading out and was not being used as much, but was still in use in a lot of places. So, The Deceived. This is a complicated book, like I was saying. I do think, though, that the psychological piece of it is well-paced and definitely has a lot of mystery. This book is more like a psychological mystery than the first book had a little more action elements to it. And I would say this book was not as scary, I think, as the first book came across. There's some humor here as well that kind of lightens the mood here and there. There is, though, one very creepy, like, kind of sequence where Scott and his friend are going to try to find out if they can figure out who Z is. And that sequence was very, very disturbing. Very creepy, the way it was all set up. It really reminded me, actually, of, like, the Poltergeist movie. Like, that kind of a vibe, where they're in, like, the suburb area. And that's all I'll say about it. So I think that this book, in the end, like I said, at the very final scenes are very intense. And I was really moving through the pages very fast when I got to the very end because it just doesn't let up, and it has a very action packed ending that's explosive. It kind of just reminds me of like a lot of ways when like 90s movies would kind of like lead up to this like very climactic ending, and it has a climactic ending that's very, very intense. You get some hints along the way throughout the books, like some breadcrumbs leading to this, so you kind of can start to piece this together if you're paying attention. And then when it does happen, you're thinking, oh no, this is actually happening. So okay, do I recommend you read The Deceived? I think if you go in with all those caveats that I just mentioned, I think it's an entertaining read. I think that it definitely it's a little creepy, a little spooky on the psychological level, and I think I had a good time reading it. I can't say I didn't. But like I said, I kind of went in with these caveats, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to set that aside because I know that that's an old time way of talking about that. So I'm going to set it aside and move along. But I did enjoy the book. So at the end of the day, I would say that I would give The Deceived 4 out of 5 stars. This book, like I said, it's complicated. There's a lot of pieces moving here, and there's a lot of kind of on the line sort of things, but I don't think it really crosses a line except with that outdated language. That's the only thing I think it did cross the line on. And of course, that's coming from a 2024 perspective, when those words that were being used in this book we know today are not ones that you should say about people. So that is my review of The Deceived by Bill Myers, book number 2 in the Forbidden Doors series. Have you read any of these books? Because it's been a trip rereading these. It's very interesting going back and reading these now from an adult perspective. So until next time, everybody, keep reading. Bye.